It's 2025. The world is teetering on the edge of disaster. North Korea, under the firm hand of Kim Jong-un, has taken the first irrevocable step into a dangerous new chapter. The international community holds its breath as the country launches a missile. The world, unsure of whether it's a conventional weapon, a nuclear threat, or a prelude to something far worse, a full-scale war. For years, North Korea has relied on a strategy of military buildup, nuclear weapons development, and diplomatic brinkmanship to protect itself from external threats and maintain its grip on power. But now, something has changed. North Korea's economy is on the brink of collapse. Its food security is precarious, and its military strength no longer provides the protection it once did. Kim Jong-un, emboldened or desperate, seems ready to push the Korean peninsula and the world into a new, uncharted conflict. The question now is simple. How will this crisis unfold? What will the ripple effect be? Well, in this exploration, we'll present 4 distinct scenarios of how this conflict could escalate and how global powers might react. Each scenario takes us down a different path, testing the limits of diplomacy, military force, and survival, of course. Before diving into the alternate paths, we'll take a deeper look at North Korea's leadership and the fragile state it's in as of 2025. This is not just a rogue nation. This is a country that has survived decades of isolation, suffering, and adversity. First thing first, North Korea's totalitarian state is ruled with an iron fist by Kim Jong-un, who inherited power from his father, Kim Jong-il, and his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, the founding leader. Kim Jong-un's leadership has been marked by increased militarization and nuclear weapons development, but also by a significant internal economic instability. And of course, typical for North Korea, social unrest. Kim Jong-un's leadership is a paradox. On one hand, he presents himself as the sole protector of his people, using nuclear weapons as a deterrent against foreign intervention. On the other, the economy is in dire straits, with sanctions from the US and their international community. The nation has been forced to rely on black market trade, cybercrime, and illicit activity to keep its economy afloat. Food insecurity is rampant, and it's believed that around 40% of the population is undernourished, struggling to survive in a state where basic necessities are often in short supply. Kim's power is derived from military might, but internally, the regime faces growing discontent. The Yangmadang, illegal markets where citizens engage in small trade, has been the lifeline for many, offering glimpses of the world beyond the borders. For a generation, North Koreans have been exposed to outside media, particularly from South Korea and the West. Despite strict government censorship, while propaganda remains pervasive, the cracks in the system are becoming more visible. Kim Jong-un's grip on power is not as secure as he would like to think. Internally, the Songbun system, a rigid class structure based on loyalty to the regime, keeps the population in check. But even that system is under stress as the youth of North Korea become increasingly dissatisfied with the regime's promises of prosperity. It begins in the early hours of a quiet morning in Seoul, South Korea. Without warning, the North Korean missile launches. The target, Seoul, the heart of South Korea and a city of nearly 10 million people. The missile isn't carrying a nuclear warhead, but the devastation is just as catastrophic. The missile strikes key military sites, power grids, and communication hubs. Thousands are killed instantly, and the city is thrown into chaos. The South Korean government scrambles to respond, but the damage has already been done. The world watches as the US and Japan move to back South Korea, but North Korea isn't done yet. This is where the real danger begins. In a world where nuclear war can't be undone, some leaders realize that only viable option is containment and negotiation. The world is on edge after a devastating missile strike. In an instant, humanity faces its darkest moment since the Cold War. The United Nations convenes an emergency session. The atmosphere is electric with fear, anger, and uncertainty. Behind closed doors, the world's biggest players, China and Russia, insist on peace talks, aware that the nuclear fallout doesn't just threaten the region, but the very survival of global stability. They argue that the stakes are far too high to allow the situation to escalate further. The United States, South Korea, and Japan, initially enraged and desperate for retribution, begrudgingly agreed to a temporary ceasefire. The world collectively holds its breath. Weeks of high-stakes diplomacy unfold in shadowy backrooms, with negotiators on the edge of their seats. The atmosphere is charged with pressure, with the threat of violence hanging over every conversation. North Korea, facing mounting international pressure, agrees to a halt on missile tests and nuclear development, not because they've been convinced by logic, but because the reality of global isolation and economic collapse is becoming too heavy to ignore. In exchange, the US offers to ease sanctions, hoping to break the deadlock. The agreement doesn't come easily though. The United States and its allies demand that North Korea dismantle its nuclear program completely, but the North Korean regime, fiercely protective of its sovereignty, isn't willing to surrender its nuclear ambitions entirely. In a surprising twist, China steps in, offering a hefty economic aid package aimed at rebuilding North Korea's decimated infrastructure. The deal is done, a delicate ceasefire, with each side walking away with concessions that leave everyone wondering if it will hold. In the aftermath of the agreement, the North Korean peninsula remains a powder keg, albeit one with a fragile lid. North Korea doesn't dismantle its nuclear arsenal. Far from it. However, the international community sets up a series of rigorous inspections designed to monitor North Korea's nuclear activities and prevent any further missile tests. North Korea's nuclear status is essentially frozen in place, with the regime still a nuclear power but under constant international scrutiny. The weapons remain, but for now, they are contained, kept under wraps in a tense truce. The Korean peninsula stays divided, with South Korea continuing to maintain its military might, backed by the United States and Japan, who bolster their alliances in the wake of the crisis. The US reduces its military footprint in the region, but its strategic influence remains intact, with both military and economic partnerships strengthened. The hope is that this uneasy peace can hold. But the region is still a high-risk zone where sparks could fly at any moment. In the long run, North Korea survives, but at a heavy price. It becomes a pariah state, isolated and struggling under the weight of international sanctions. Even as the regime clings to its nuclear capabilities, the economy stagnates, and the average citizen bears the brunt of global isolation. North Korea remains a volatile actor in global politics, and while the immediate threat of nuclear conflict is reduced, the underlying tensions remain unresolved. The regime, though crippled by sanctions, continues to engage in provocative actions that keep the world on edge. Meanwhile, South Korea, Japan, and the US emerge from the crisis with their alliances stronger than ever. Their military cooperation deepens, with joint exercises and defense pacts growing more robust. But even as they breathe easier in the short term, the shadow of North Korea's nuclear arsenal looms large over East Asia. Each new missile test or military provocation from the north sends shockwaves through the region, keeping everyone on high alert. The nuclear threat, though contained for now, hasn't disappeared. The world has learned the painful lesson that while war can be avoided, peace is a precarious thing, especially when it comes to weapons of mass destruction. And as global diplomacy continues to unfold, everyone knows the clock is ticking and the stakes could not be higher. In a world where the fragile balance of diplomacy crumbles, the unthinkable happens. War erupts on the Korean peninsula. The stakes are catastrophic, and the world is thrown into chaos. The world's worst fears are realized as North Korea, unwilling to back down from its nuclear ambitions, launches a full-scale attack on South Korea. The initial missile strike that started the crisis was just the beginning. This time, North Korea escalates quickly, using ballistic missiles, cyber attacks, and conventional forces in a coordinated assault aimed at crippling South Korea's defenses. Seoul, already heavily damaged by the initial missile salvo, becomes the target of a nuclear warhead, detonating in the heart of the capital. The explosion is catastrophic, obliterating large parts of the city, incinerating millions in seconds. The shockwave radiates outward, causing chaos and panic throughout the region. The death toll soars into the millions, with entire families and neighborhoods wiped out in the blink of an eye. This is no longer a skirmish. It is a full-blown nuclear warfare. In the wake of the nuclear devastation, South Korea retaliates with all-out military force, launching airstrikes, artillery bombardments, and ground assaults against North Korean military positions. The United States, bound by its defense treaty with South Korea, moves swiftly to intervene. B-52 bombers are unleashed, dropping precision-guided bombs on North Korea's key military infrastructure, nuclear facilities, and air defense systems. The United States also activates its Pacific Fleet, sending carrier strike groups to enforce naval blockades and launch further strikes on North Korean military bases. The death toll climbs rapidly as the fighting intensifies, and the two countries become locked in an unrelenting spiral of destruction. China, North Korea's closest and most powerful ally, is now faced with an impossible dilemma. Though Beijing has long supported the Kim regime, its loyalty to North Korea is now tested by the reality of a full-scale war. As the conflict intensifies, millions of refugees flood across the border into China, putting enormous strain on China's already fragile infrastructure. Global markets collapse, causing financial panic worldwide. The Chinese economy, deeply interconnected with the global system, suffers catastrophic losses as sanctions bite harder and international trade grinds to a halt. Faced with mounting pressure, China enters the fray, not as an ally of North Korea, but as a peacekeeper. The Chinese government sends peacekeeping forces into North Korea and South Korea, hoping to stabilize the region and prevent a wider conflict from spreading. But the situation is beyond control. China is forced to navigate an increasingly volatile war zone, where every decision risks global escalation. As the conflict reaches its boiling point, the situation becomes increasingly dire. Both sides suffer massive casualties, and a nuclear standoff becomes inevitable. North Korea, seeing its survival hanging by a thread, launches a limited nuclear strike on US military bases in the Pacific, targeting Guam, Okinawa, and other strategic locations. The explosions are devastating, killing thousands of American military personnel and sending shockwaves through global security. In retaliation, the United States fired back with its own nuclear missiles, targeting North Korea's remaining nuclear facilities and military strongholds. The cycle of nuclear retaliation spins out of control. Days later, the world is teetering on the brink of total annihilation. The Korean peninsula becomes a war zone, where major cities like Seoul, Pyongyang, Busan, and more are obliterated, leaving nothing but ash and ruins in their wake. The global economy collapses under the weight of the war. Financial markets crash, and trade routes grind to a halt. Countries reliant on the technology, trade, and raw materials that once flowed from the Korean peninsula face unprecedented economic chaos. The industries, especially in technology and automotive manufacturing, grind to a halt, creating a ripple effect that spans the globe. Food and energy shortages become widespread as nations scramble to deal with the fallout. In the aftermath of the conflict, North Korea, utterly devastated, collapses. The regime of Kim Jong-un is decimated, and the country is left in ruins. The power vacuum left in the wake of the war leads to internal instability, with various factions vying for control over what's left of the shattered state. With large swaths of the Korean Peninsula, rendered uninhabitable for generations to come. Radiation levels in affected areas soar, and entire ecosystems are wiped out. Parts of the peninsula are left as a toxic wasteland, where life is impossible. The consequences for the global economy are no less severe. Nations, once dependent on the technology, trade, and natural resources of the Korean Peninsula, experience massive economic disruptions, with entire sectors of the global market collapsing. For decades to come, international relations are reshaped, with countries reconsidering their military alliances, nuclear policies, and strategies for global peace. The war leaves scars that last for generations. The global nuclear order is forever altered, with the catastrophic use of nuclear weapons serving as a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked military escalation. The world's reliance on diplomacy is forever shaken, and the specter of nuclear war looms larger than ever before. The environmental consequences of the nuclear exchanges are profound, with entire regions of East Asia rendered uninhabitable due to fallout. The long-term effects of radiation poisoning will affect generations, and the already fragile ecosystems will take centuries to recover. The global political order is thrown into disarray. New alliances are formed, and all alliances, especially those with China, Russia, and the US, are re-examined in the light of the war's unprecedented devastation. Nations begin to question the wisdom of their reliance on nuclear weapons and their ability to contain such a catastrophic conflict. In the end, the Korean War becomes not just a regional disaster, but a global turning point, a moment when the world was forced to reckon with the true cost of nuclear warfare. The ghosts of the past linger in the ruins, and the world can never forget devastation it has witnessed. The shadow of the bomb looms large, and peace, if it ever returns, is uncertain at best. In a stunning turn of events, the long-reigning Kim dynasty begins to unravel from within, triggering a devastating internal collapse that shakes North Korea to its very core. After decades of brutal control, Kim Jong-un's grip on power begins to fray as internal tensions reach a breaking point. The regime, already crippled by economic sanctions and decaying domestic economy, can no longer sustain the lavish lifestyle of the elite or the oppressive demands of the ruling class. Economic hardship becomes unbearable for ordinary North Koreans, and disillusionment with Kim's leadership spreads like a wildfire. The military, once a loyal enforcer of the Kim regime, begins to splinter. Key military commanders, frustrated with the lack of resources and growing awareness of the regime's weakening position, start to question Kim's ability to lead. Military defections become increasingly common as generals and lower-ranking officers abandon the regime in favor of pursuing their own power. Simultaneously, a growing underground movement of reformists, spurred on by rumors of potential liberalization and increasing dissatisfaction with the status quo, starts to gain momentum. Pro-China elements, seeking an opportunity to reshape the country's future, begin to move in the shadows. It becomes clear to Kim that his iron-fisted rule can no longer hold the country together. As discontent spreads, the first signs of civil unrest break out in the capital, Pyongyang. Protests erupt, demanding food, freedom, and change. The government's response is swift and violent, but it's clear that the regime no longer has the ability to quell the rising tide of opposition. What began as isolated protests spirals into something much more dangerous, an impending internal coup that threatens to fracture the entire country. As Kim Jong-un's authority disintegrates, the power vacuum grows even wider. Once the stalwart leader of the nation, Kim finds himself surrounded by enemies on all sides. As military leaders and political factions scramble for power, North Korea is plunged into civil war. different factions quickly emerge, each vying for control of the country. On one side, military generals, increasingly independent and hungry for power, begin to carve out their own territories, relying on their loyal troops to defend them. These factions range from hardline, ultranationalist generals wanting to maintain the status quo to more pragmatic commanders who seek a potential deal with China or the international community. On another front, pro-China factions, mostly centered around former diplomats and military officers with ties to Beijing. This faction sees an opportunity to establish a more China-aligned regime in Pyongyang. These factions promise economic support in exchange for loyalty, though they too must fight to hold on to their piece of the crumbling nation. Simultaneously, reformist leaders within the party apparatus push for a shift toward market-oriented reforms and an eventual rapprochement with the outside world. They rally intellectuals, disillusioned citizens, and the more forward-thinking military officers, but these reformists are few and far between, and they must also contend with hardline forces that view any compromise with the outside world as treason. As the country descends into chaos, battles rage in the streets of Pyongyang and other major cities, leaving large swaths of the country in ruins. The Kim regime's collapse is complete, and with it, any semblance of centralized control. North Korea fractures into a patchwork of warring factions, each holding different territory, and the once unified nation is now a fragmented war zone, where each group fights for dominance. With the complete collapse of the regime, North Korea is no longer a single entity, but a collection of self-styled warlords and military commanders, each controlling their own region. In the absence of a central government, humanitarian aid begins to flood the country, but the scale of the crisis is so immense that aid organizations struggle to reach the far-flung corners of the country. Famine, disease, and brutal fighting between factions devastate the population. Millions of civilians are caught in the crossfire, while others seek refuge in border regions, particularly in China, where fleeing North Koreans are met with a mixed response. Some are accepted into refugee camps, while others are forcibly repatriated, creating a humanitarian nightmare on both sides of the border. The country's nuclear arsenal, once carefully controlled by Kim Jong-un and his closest military commanders, is now in the hands of fractured nations, some of which have no desire to play by international rules. These rogue groups, desperate for leverage or simply trying to survive, begin to negotiate with each other over control of North Korea's nuclear weapons, threatening to plunge the entire region into further chaos. The United States, South Korea, and other key international powers race to secure North Korea's nuclear arsenal, fearing that the collapse could lead to rogue factions gaining control of weapons of mass destruction. Special forces units are deployed to critical sites across the Korean peninsula, as the US and South Korea scramble to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to unstable elements. Meanwhile, China finds itself in a delicate position. It has long relied on North Korea as a buffer against American influence in the region, but a collapsed North Korea is more dangerous than ever. As millions of North Korean refugees pour across the border, China is forced to step in with limited military intervention, hoping to stabilize the region and prevent it from spinning out of control. However, Beijing's influence is limited, and its ability to enforce order is diminished. Russia and Japan, too, offer limited support, but none of them want to become embroiled in a full-scale military conflict. In the heart of the Korean peninsula, South Korea braces for a possible spillover effect from the civil war, preparing for an influx of refugees and the potential for increased instability along the border. Military and civilian planners alike prepare for a worst-case scenario, where the conflict spreads beyond the north and threatens the peaceful status quo on the peninsula. While North Korea may be fractured, the Korean peninsula remains divided along ideological and military lines. South Korea, for all its resilience, is faced with a fractured neighbor in a state of internal chaos, and there's no immediate solution for reunification. Each faction within North Korea is too busy fighting for control to even entertain the idea of peace talks, and the situation is too complex for any foreign intervention to resolve it quickly. Reunification, if it ever happens, is now a distant dream, one that seems less and less likely as the years pass. The humanitarian crisis in North Korea is devastating. With the regime gone, the country's infrastructure lies in ruins, and there's no one to pick up the pieces. Basic necessities, food, medical supplies, clean water are in short supply, and millions of people are left in desperate need of an aid. The United Nations and international organizations struggle to provide relief, but the scale of the disaster is overwhelming. Many areas of the country are essentially no-go zones, controlled by warlords or hostile factions who prevent aid from reaching those who need it most. On the global stage, the economic impact is profound. For years to come, the world will feel the ripples of North Korea's collapse, as the region remains volatile and the nuclear threat continues to hang over East Asia. Ultimately, the end of the Kim dynasty marks the beginning of a new era, one defined by chaos, fragmentation, and uncertainty. North Korea, once an isolated and brutal dictatorship, is now a battleground of competing forces, each seeking control over the remnants of the shattered nation. The international community, exhausted and on edge, watches helplessly as the region sinks deeper into anarchy. In the wake of this crisis, the Korean peninsula remains divided, with no clear path forward for reunification or peace. In a world where the threat of nuclear war hangs over the Korean peninsula, global leaders manage to defuse the situation with an unprecedented diplomatic breakthrough. What begins as a conflict spiraling out of control turns into a historic moment that reshapes the region's future. The situation has reached a point where no one can afford to gamble with further escalation. In the midst of widespread devastation, it becomes painfully clear that the stakes are too high for either side to continue the conflict. As military clashes continue and diplomatic channels seem to close, back-channel negotiations secretly begin. These behind-the-scenes talks are led by China, Russia, and the United States, three global powers with vested interests in the region's stability. At first, the process is slow. Kim Jong-un, facing mounting internal pressure, military defections, and a deteriorating economy, is reluctant to engage in talks. But as his grip on power weakens and the international community rallies behind a unified peace push, the message becomes clear. The cost of continued war is too great for North Korea, and a new path must be forged. Behind closed doors, the diplomats work tirelessly. China, traditionally North Korea's closest ally, understands that maintaining regional stability requires a shift away from confrontation. Russia plays the role of stabilizer, pushing for a solution that ensures its own influence while maintaining peace. The United States, having exhausted all other options, agrees to soften its demands in return for concrete nuclear disarmament and an agreement to halt further military escalation. Through extensive mediation, the negotiations finally succeed in convincing Kim Jong-un to accept a ceasefire and enter into a historic peace agreement, one that could forever alter the trajectory of the Korean peninsula. After days of tense and high-stakes talks, Kim Jong-un agrees to a historic peace agreement, marking a monumental shift from the brink of war to the path of diplomacy. The agreement represents an unexpected turning point, driven by both pragmatic realities and a shared desire for peace. The key provisions of the deal are as follows. Nuclear freeze. In a major concession, North Korea agrees to freeze its nuclear weapons program and immediately halt all missile tests. This marks a historic step in denuclearization efforts. North Korea also opens its nuclear facilities to international inspectors, ensuring transparency and accountability, a move long demanded by the US and its allies. In return, sanctions imposed on North Korea are partially lifted, though strict monitoring remains in place to ensure compliance. The North's nuclear stockpile is not dismantled outright, but this freeze is seen as a crucial step in preventing further nuclear escalation. Economic cooperation and aid. In exchange for freezing its nuclear program, North Korea receives economic aid from the international community, led by South Korea, the United States, and China. This aid is designed to address the humanitarian crisis while facilitating long-term economic reform. South Korea plays a critical role in rebuilding North Korea's infrastructure, with a special focus on critical sectors like energy, agriculture, and transportation. Joint economic zones are established along the border, intended to promote cooperation and trade between the two countries. Military de-escalation. A central component of the agreement is the reduction of military forces along the border. Both North and South Korea agree to de-escalate military tensions and establish a new demilitarized zone, DMZ, with an emphasis on peace building and humanitarian exchanges. This DMZ is designed not only as a buffer zone, but also as a symbol of the commitment to peace between the two countries. South Korea and North Korea agreed to limit their military deployments near the DMZ, and joint humanitarian missions, including the reparations of displaced civilians and the provision of food and medical aid, are authorized. The role of China. China offers substantial economic support to North Korea, playing a pivotal role in ensuring regional stability. In exchange for this support, China ensures North Korea will not seek to destabilize the region, and it works with the United States and South Korea to maintain peace. China also agrees to act as a mediator in any future disputes, helping to stabilize the broader East Asian region. A new Korean Peninsula Treaty. The culmination of this peace agreement is the signing of the Korean Peninsula Treaty, a formal accord that outlines the steps toward long-term peace and reconciliation. It includes provisions for continued diplomatic engagement, mutual recognition of sovereignty, and the gradual integration of North Korea into the global economy. The Korean Peninsula Peace Accord is an astonishing diplomatic achievement, a fragile peace that ends the military conflict and sets the stage for cooperation and gradual economic integration. Though the deal does not solve all the region's problems, it provides a framework for addressing key issues, such as denuclearization, economic development, and regional stability. The immediate impact is significant. The guns fall silent, the risk of nuclear escalation recedes, and the region begins to rebuild. However, the peace deal remains fragile. Internal divisions in North Korea, ranging from military hardliners to reform-minded leaders, continue to pose risks. Additionally, regional actors like China, Russia, and the United States will need to maintain pressure on all sides to ensure the deal's survival. While the peace deal marks a new era for the Korean Peninsula, the challenges are far from over. The road to true reconciliation between North and South Korea will be long and filled with obstacles, including economic disparities, political differences, and lingering mistrust. South Korea and North Korea begin the long and difficult task of integrating their economies. Over time, North Korea slowly opens its markets to international trade, and new industries begin to emerge. Though the process is halting and uneven, South Korea plays a leading role in the reconstruction of North Korea, rebuilding critical infrastructure and helping to address the country's humanitarian crisis. However, much of the social and economic damage from the conflict will take decades to heal. The Korean Peninsula Peace Accord has profound implications for regional stability in East Asia. It signals a shift away from military confrontation and toward cooperation, but it also shifts the balance of power in the region, especially with China now playing a central role in maintaining stability. In the end, the Korean Peninsula Peace Accord represents a new chapter in the region's history, offering hope for a future built on diplomacy and cooperation rather than conflict. Though fragile, this historic agreement offers the promise of peace for a region that has long been defined by division, distrust, and war. In a world bracing for catastrophe, the historic peace deal between North and South Korea shakes the globe. The agreement, which seemed impossible just months earlier, marks a turning point in the region's history. The immediate threat of war is averted, and while the situation is far from perfect, a new era of engagement begins to take shape. Peninsula begins to stabilize in ways no one could have imagined. The road to peace is bumpy, but over time, the agreement begins to bear fruit. The Korean Peninsula Peace Accord, despite its imperfections, serves as a springboard for a new phase of cooperation, rebuilding, and transformation. The region, once mired in tension and fear, begins to move towards something closer to prosperity and stability, at least for the moment. One of the most significant outcomes of the peace deal is the remarkable economic revival of North Korea. Thanks to the economic cooperation outlined in the peace accord, both North Korea and South Korea begin to forge a new economic relationship. The partnership is initially cautious, but over time, joint ventures in technology, agriculture, and infrastructure begin to reshape the North Korean economy. North Korea's economy, once crippled by sanctions and isolation, begins to rebuild. South Korea takes the lead in providing critical infrastructure investments, focusing on energy, transportation, and technology. International companies, spurred by the prospect of stability and new markets, begin to invest in North Korea, particularly in the sectors like tourism, like manufacturing, and energy. The economic links between China and North Korea deepen, with trade routes expanding and investment flowing into North Korean enterprises. Over time, this economic integration strengthens North Korea's fragile economy and brings it into the fold of regional trade networks. Joint economic zones along the border areas create new opportunities for collaboration. For the first time, North Korean and South Korean businesses work side by side, and the once impenetrable border is now home to thriving cross-border trade hubs. While the political changes in North Korea are still in the works, humanitarian improvements begin to transform the everyday lives of ordinary North Koreans. International aid floods into the country, bringing with it much-needed food, medicine, and basic supplies. South Korea's aid programs, led by both the government and private organizations, focus on education, healthcare, and housing. South Korean doctors, teachers, and engineers begin working in joint efforts to rebuild North Korea's infrastructure, establishing new schools, hospitals, and public services across the country. Food insecurity, while not fully eradicated, becomes less of a pressing issue. North Korea, under the pressure of both domestic and international scrutiny, begins to slowly address its food production challenges. Particularly with the help of South Korean agricultural expertise, farmers in the North Korea gain access to new techniques and modern farming equipment, and the country's healthcare system, though still rudimentary, improves as a result of South Korean support and global partnerships. Access to information increases gradually. While the Kim regime remains in power for now, the inflow of foreign media, internet access, and global communication channels begin to alter the landscape of North Korean society. Censorship loosens slightly, allowing North Koreans to access some outside information, though state control over the media remains strong. Despite these small steps, political freedoms are still limited, and the totalitarian regime is far from gone. Though the regime remains firmly in the hands of Kim Jong-un, the atmosphere within North Korea starts to shift. Reform whispers begin to spread as the country opens up to the outside world, creating the possibility of small but meaningful changes. Internal shifts within the ruling class signal that Kim Jong-un may be open to gradual reform. He continues to wield absolute power, but the regime has no choice but to respond to both internal pressure and international demands. Politicians, once entrenched in the hardline policies, are now forced to consider the benefits of economic liberalization. The international community presses for human rights reforms and more freedom of expression, while real political change is still a distant hope. While Kim Jong-un's regime remains solid for the time being, it becomes increasingly clear that North Korean society is beginning to experience tectonic shifts, both from within and throughout external influences. Small civil liberties are granted, though true democratic reform is still a long way off. As the Korean Peninsula Peace Accord begins to reshape the landscape, the balance of power in East Asia is shifting in significant ways. The peace deal's far-reaching effects send ripples throughout the entire region, bringing new security challenges and opportunities for international diplomacy. While the peace agreement stabilizes the Korean Peninsula, it also elevates China's role as a dominant player in East Asia. China's economic influence over North Korea grows exponentially as it becomes a central economic partner for the reformed North. With its influence in the region now secured, China takes on an increasingly significant role in regional diplomacy. China's support for North Korea is seen as a strategic move to strengthen its influence in the broader East Asian security environment. As the North continues its path toward limited reform, Beijing positions itself as both an economic partner and a regional stabilizer, keeping a close eye on developments within the North while seeking to maintain influence over South Korea and the broader East Asian sphere. Meanwhile, the United States, though still committed to its defense treaties with South Korea and Japan, finds itself having to adjust to the new reality in East Asia. China's growing economic clout poses a challenge to American influence in the region, particularly in terms of trade, security, and diplomatic leverage. In response to China's increase in influence, South Korea, Japan, and the United States form even stronger defense and economic alliances. The trio works closely to create a regional security framework that balances the power dynamics in the region and responds to new challenges. Cybersecurity becomes a growing concern as countries in the region begin to share intelligence and improve their collective defense capabilities. The growing focus on trade agreements and economic cooperation helps to strengthen ties, as these three nations collaborate on new regional initiatives. The Japan, South Korea, US trilateral relationship deepens, particularly in the areas of trade, technology, and security cooperation. This partnership allows the countries to focus on common challenges, such as addressing the rise of China's economic dominance and controlling cyber threats, all while reducing the risks of a renewed military standoff with North Korea. The next decade will be crucial in determining whether the peace that's been established can endure and, more importantly, whether North Korea will continue to evolve or slip back into isolation. The economic and political transformation of the country is just beginning, and the international community's role in fostering that change will be pivotal. The integration of North Korea into the global economy is still in its infancy, and the challenges are immense. Infrastructure rebuilds are underway, and some industries are beginning to show signs of growth, but the country still faces immense economic hurdles. Sanctions relief and international investment are critical to ensuring continued progress. But there is a deep mistrust within the North Korean elite about fully embracing a market economy. The regime may open up in small doses, but full economic integration with the world could take decades to achieve. While small political reforms are happening in the form of increased access to information and more responsive governance, the Kim regime remains firmly in control. Kim Jong-un's leadership is unlikely to be challenged in the short term. But as the economic prosperity begins to change the lives of ordinary North Koreans, popular demand for greater freedoms may grow. Whether the regime can adapt to these new pressures, or whether it will fall back into more traditional methods of repression, will be a defining factor in the years to come. As the world's focus shifts toward North Korea's economic progress, the issue of human rights remains an open question. The international community will continue to push for greater freedoms and more openness, but humanitarian challenges such as forced labor and political prisoners are unlikely to be fully addressed in the near future. The slow pace of reform on the political front will remain a thorn in the side of the peace deal's critics. China has cemented its role as the key power broker in the region. Its economic influence over North Korea is undeniable, and Beijing will continue to drive regional diplomacy. However, China's increasing dominance will cause friction with the US and its allies, who may perceive Beijing's influence as a challenge to their interests in East Asia. Navigating this delicate balance will be crucial for maintaining peace in the region. For South Korea, the peace deal brings both opportunity and anxiety. The promise of reunification remains an ideal, but the path toward a unified Korea is fraught with economic, cultural, and political challenges. South Koreans will need to balance the temptation of reuniting with the reality of integrating two vastly different societies. While the economic benefits of a more integrated peninsula are tantalizing, deep societal divides and security concerns will continue to test the South's resolve. Both Japan and the United States will have to adjust a new regional order. Japan, with its own security concerns about North Korea's nuclear program, will likely continue to strengthen its military ties with South Korea and the United States, of course. However, as China grows in the power and influence, Japan may have to recalibrate its own defense strategy, navigating between regional alliances and the looming presence of China. For the United States, the challenge will be maintaining its commitments to South Korea and Japan, while balancing its relationship with China. As China's influence in the North grows, the US will need to engage diplomatically to ensure that its alliances in East Asia remain strong and that regional security remains a priority. Cybersecurity, trade agreements, and counterterrorism will become focal points for US, South Korean, Japanese cooperation. But China's role will always be a balancing act. Despite the optimism that the Korean Peninsula Peace Accord has brought, the situation remains precarious. North Korea's leadership is known for its unpredictability, and the Kim regime has shown time and time again that it is willing to take drastic actions when its interests are threatened. While the economic reforms are taking hold, the pace of change is slow, and North Korea's totalitarian government is still very much in control. The regional stability provided by the peace deal is fragile, and as history has shown, the balance of power in East Asia can shift quickly. Tensions between US and China, military provocations, or internal politics upheaval within North Korea could quickly unravel the fragile peace. Despite this, there is a cautious optimism. For the first time in decades, the Korean Peninsula is moving away from its precipice of war. The peace deal represents not just a halt to immediate hostilities, but a window of opportunity for long-term stability. The time will tell if the countries involved can continue on the path of cooperation or if the same old tensions will flare up again. But for now, there is a new sense of hope, even if it's tempered by the knowledge that the future of the region is still uncertain. The Korean Peninsula Peace Accord has created a new reality for the region, one defined by hope and caution in equal measure. Economic cooperation begins to rebuild the North, while humanitarian improvements raise the quality of life for many. Political reforms are slow, but the winds of change are unmistakable. While the peace may hold, for now, the region remains on edge. Will North Korea continue on its path of gradual reform? Can the international community keep the pressure on the regime for meaningful change? Only time will tell, but for now, the world has a chance to breathe a little easier. The Korean Peninsula, once a ticking time bomb, now exists in a fragile equilibrium, where hope and uncertainty coexist, but the world remains on alert, knowing that even the most historic peace deals can unravel if not managed carefully. South Korea, North Korea, China, and the United States will have to work tirelessly in the coming years to maintain the stability they've achieved, while being mindful of the deep-seated tensions that still exist beneath the surface. The Korean Peninsula, a region long defined by division, distrust, and the looming shadow of nuclear threat, stands at a critical juncture. Through the dramatic scenarios explored in this video, we've seen the wide spectrum of potential outcomes, from the hope of diplomacy and negotiated peace to the catastrophic consequences of a full-scale war and regime collapse. In each scenario, the stakes could not be higher. The first option, the cold peace, offers a fragile, uneasy truce, a delicate balance of power where North Korea's nuclear ambitions are contained, but not eradicated. The global community watches nervously, knowing that even the smallest spark could ignite a larger conflict. This tenuous peace hinges on constant vigilance, international cooperation, and a willingness to engage in diplomacy, however difficult or slow. The military confrontation scenario paints a far darker picture, where failed diplomacy leads to a devastating nuclear war. In this tragic outcome, the world witnesses not only the collapse of North Korea, but a regional and global catastrophe, economically, environmentally, and socially. The sheer cost of war in this context serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of escalation in an age where nuclear weapons are a reality, not a threat of the past. In the regime collapse scenario, the unraveling of North Korea from within brings a new level of instability. The power vacuum left in the wake of Kim Jong-un's downfall leads to civil war, mass suffering, and the terrifying possibility of nuclear weapons falling into the hands of rogue factions. As the country fractures into chaos, the global community faces a desperate scramble to prevent further disaster, highlighting the complex and unpredictable nature of totalitarian regimes and the dangers of their collapse. And finally, the diplomatic breakthrough presents a moment of hope. A stunning peace agreement that defies expectations and ushers in a new era of cooperation. While this outcome remains fragile, it offers the possibility of a more stable and prosperous future for the Korean Peninsula, driven by international collaboration and mutual compromise. However, the road to true peace is long and uncertain, and the world must remain watchful to ensure that this hard-won peace does not slip away. The overarching lesson of these scenarios is clear. The future of Korean Peninsula, and by extension the global order, depends on choices made today. Will the world rise to the challenge of diplomacy, working together to contain the threat of nuclear escalation, or will it fall into the abyss of conflict, where the consequences are felt for generations to come? As we look toward the future, one thing is certain. The stakes are higher than ever. The world is at a crossroads, and the path it takes will shape the course of history. The clock is ticking, and the choices made by leaders and the international community as a whole will determine whether the Korean Peninsula remains a flashpoint for disaster or evolves into a beacon of diplomacy, cooperation, and long-lasting peace. In this precarious moment, the world must ask, can peace be forged, or is the shadow of war too great to overcome? Only time will tell. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you the next time.